Put it back, the grocery manager told the elderly woman. Then the cashier paid for it herself. The grocery store went strangely quiet when the manager pointed at the loaf of bread in the elderly woman's hands. Ma'am, if you can't pay for it, you need to put it back. 74-year-old Margaret Ellis froze beside the checkout counter. In front of her were a carton of eggs, a small bottle of milk, canned soup, oatmeal, bananas, and a few other groceries that wouldn't have looked important to anyone else. But Margaret wasn't looking at the groceries. She was looking at the coins in her palm. Behind the register, 29-year-old cashier Emily Parker watched Margaret count them again. Once, twice, then a third time, as if $12.43 might somehow become $18 if she was patient enough. It didn't. Margaret slowly picked up the bread. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought I had enough." The manager, David Collins, wasn't shouting. That almost made the moment worse. "It's all right. Just put back whatever you can't pay for." Margaret nodded and reached toward the counter. Emily looked at the bread, then at the milk, then at the elderly woman's hands, trembling slightly as she decided what she could live without. And before she had enough time to think about what she was doing, Emily reached into her own pocket. "I'll pay for it." David turned toward her. "Emily." She already knew that tone. Employees at Bellwether Market weren't supposed to pay for customers' purchases while working. "I said I'll pay for it." David stared at her. Margaret immediately shook her head. "No, sweetheart, please. I don't want you getting into trouble because of me." But Emily had already taken out her card. What none of them knew was that this wasn't really a story about $18 of groceries. Before the week was over, Emily would learn why Margaret had suddenly started counting coins after shopping at the same store for 22 years. David would be forced to explain why a rule that looked cruel had been created in the first place. And Margaret would make a decision that neither of them expected. Because sometimes doing the kind thing is easy. Living with what happens afterward is harder. Bellwether Market sat on the corner of Franklin and Willow in a Pennsylvania town small enough that people still recognized one another in the grocery aisles. Emily Parker had worked register for almost 6 years. She knew which customers wanted paper bags, which ones brought coupons folded inside envelopes, and which ones would stand at the register talking long after their receipt had printed. Margaret Ellis belonged to the last group. Every Thursday morning, usually around 10, Margaret came through Emily's line. She was the kind of customer employees remembered without really knowing why. She bought almost the same things every week: oatmeal, milk, eggs, tea, a small bag of apples, sometimes chicken if it was discounted, and always one small cinnamon roll from the bakery. "That's my unnecessary luxury," Margaret used to joke. Emily would smile. "Living dangerously again, Mrs. Ellis?" "At my age, somebody has to." Margaret wasn't wealthy. Everyone could see that. Her winter coat was several years old. She carried the same faded handbag. Her shoes were clean but worn around the edges. But she had never seemed desperate till 3 weeks earlier. The first thing Emily noticed was the cinnamon roll disappearing, then the apples, then the chicken. Margaret started buying canned soup instead. One Thursday, she returned a box of tea after seeing the total. The following week, she stood in aisle 7 comparing 2 cans of beans for nearly 5 minutes because one was 27 cents cheaper. Emily noticed, but she didn't ask. There is a strange line between caring about someone and embarrassing them. Emily knew that line well. She had grown up watching her own mother stretch grocery money until payday. She remembered being 11 years old and pretending not to notice when her mother put cereal back because the electricity bill had been higher than expected. Children notice those things. They just learn not to mention them. So when Margaret started counting coins, Emily understood more than Margaret realized. David Collins noticed too. David was 46 and had managed Bellwether Market for almost 9 years. Most employees described him with the same word: strict. He checked receipts. He checked closing times. He checked damaged inventory. And if a policy existed, David expected people to follow it. Emily didn't dislike him, but she didn't understand him either. He wasn't cruel. He was simply the kind of person who seemed to believe every problem could be solved by pointing to the correct paragraph in an employee handbook. That Thursday, Margaret's total was $27.86. She had $21.14. "I'll leave the eggs," Margaret said. Emily removed them. And the bananas. Emily removed those too. Margaret counted again. Still short. The milk. Emily stopped. "Mrs. Ellis." "The milk too, sweetheart." David was standing several feet away reviewing a delivery sheet. Emily removed it. Margaret counted again. Still short by a little more than $2. Finally, she picked up the bread. That was when David walked over. He had seen the line forming behind her. "Is there a problem?" Margaret looked embarrassed. "No, I'm sorry, I'm just putting a few things back." David looked at the items beside the register, then at the customers waiting. "Let's keep the line moving." Margaret nodded quickly. She reached for the bread. "Ma'am, if you can't pay for it, you need to put it back." Emily saw Margaret's face, and something inside her snapped. Not anger exactly, memory. Her mother at a grocery store, a box of cereal being returned, a child pretending not to understand. "I'll pay for it." The sentence came out before Emily had decided to say it. David's expression immediately changed. "Emily, don't. It isn't even $7. That's not the point. Maybe you've met someone like David, the kind of person who says, 'That's not the point,' when, from where you're standing, $7 seems to be exactly the point." Emily reached for her wallet. David lowered his voice. "You know the policy." Margaret looked between them. "Please don't. I'll put it back." Emily looked at her. "No, take it." She paid for the bread, eggs, milk, and bananas herself. Margaret's eyes filled slightly. "You shouldn't have done that." "It's groceries." "No," Margaret said quietly. "It's more than groceries when someone else pays for them." Emily didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. Margaret took her bags and left. David waited until the line disappeared. Then he said the words Emily had expected. "My office. After your break." For the next 40 minutes, Emily replayed the incident in her head. She was angry, mostly at David, but underneath the anger was something else. Fear. She needed this job. Her rent had increased twice in 3 years. Her car had 168,000 miles on it. And the amount she'd just spent helping Margaret wasn't insignificant to her either. Kindness is very easy to recommend when somebody else is paying for it. At 11:30, Emily entered David's office. He closed the door. "You knew the rule." "Yes." "And you ignored it." "Yes." "Why?" Emily stared at him. "Because she needed food?" "You don't know that." "She was putting back milk and eggs because she was $6 short." "That doesn't tell you why." Emily almost laughed. What possible explanation would make that better? David leaned back. "That's exactly the problem." He opened a drawer and removed a thin folder. 3 years earlier, Bellwether Market had allowed employees to help customers informally. Sometimes that meant applying forgotten coupons. Sometimes employees used damaged item discounts. Sometimes they paid small balances themselves. Then people started taking advantage. One cashier repeatedly marked products damaged for friends. Another let a relative leave without paying for items. Customers learned which employees would cover small balances. Arguments started when other employees refused. One customer deliberately came short every Friday because she knew a particular cashier would pay. The store eventually lost several $1,000s before management ended the practice. "So, yes," David said, "we made a rule." Emily folded her arms. "You're comparing Mrs. Ellis to people stealing." "No, I'm telling you why managers don't get to create policy based on who looks sympathetic." That stopped her, because she hated admitting it. But he wasn't entirely wrong. David continued, "If I let you do it, what do I tell Jenna tomorrow when she wants to pay for somebody? What do I tell another customer who asks why we helped Margaret but not him? You tell them we're human. And when being human becomes inconsistent? Emily didn't answer. David looked tired now rather than angry. I'm giving you a written warning. Not because you helped her, because you ignored a policy after I told you not to. Emily signed the paper. She walked out still convinced she'd done the right thing, but no longer convinced David was simply heartless. That difference mattered. The following Thursday, 10 o'clock came. Margaret didn't. At 10:15, Emily looked toward the entrance. At 10:30, she checked again. By 11, she told herself she was being ridiculous. Margaret was a customer. Customers changed routines. Still, something felt wrong. The next Thursday, Margaret didn't come either. Emily mentioned it to Jenna, another cashier. Maybe she's shopping somewhere cheaper. Maybe. Jenna looked at her. You're worried. I'm curious. That's what worried people call it? When they don't want to admit they're worried. Emily rolled her eyes. But that evening, something happened. A teenage boy came through Register 4 carrying bread, peanut butter, and canned soup. Emily recognized the faded reusable shopping bag immediately. It belonged to Margaret. Excuse me, Emily said. Do you know Margaret Ellis? The boy looked surprised. She's my grandmother. Emily's stomach tightened. Is she okay? He hesitated. She fell. Margaret had collapsed in her kitchen 4 days earlier. Not because of some dramatic, mysterious illness. Because she had become dizzy. She hadn't broken anything, but doctors wanted to keep her under observation. Emily asked the question before she could stop herself. Had she been eating? The boy's silence answered first. Then he said, Not much. That night, Emily couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, she did something she knew David wouldn't like. She asked Jenna to cover her register during lunch. Then she drove to Bellwether County Hospital. Margaret was sitting upright in bed when Emily entered. For a second, the elderly woman looked confused, then embarrassed. Oh, sweetheart, you didn't have to come. Emily placed a small bag of magazines beside the bed. I know. Margaret smiled. Then why did you? Because you disappeared. Margaret looked toward the window. Emily sat beside her. For several minutes, they talked about ordinary things. The weather, the store, the terrible hospital coffee. Then Emily finally asked, What happened? Margaret tried to dismiss it. Emily waited. Silence can sometimes be more persuasive than questions. Finally, Margaret spoke. Her husband, Robert, had died 8 months earlier. Emily knew that part. What she didn't know was that Robert had handled almost all of their finances. After his death, Margaret discovered several medical debts she hadn't understood. Her Social Security check covered the mortgage, utilities, and most necessities. Barely. Then her prescription insurance changed. A medication that had cost her $18 a month now cost more than $140. So, you stopped buying food? Margaret smiled sadly. No, I started buying less food. There's a difference people make when they're trying to preserve their pride. Emily understood it immediately. Why didn't you tell anyone? Tell them what? That I'm 74 years old and can't organize my own life? That you needed help? Margaret's expression hardened slightly. I don't want charity. Emily remembered those exact words from the store. It isn't charity if... Yes, it is. Margaret wasn't angry. She was afraid, and suddenly Emily realized something. She had assumed paying for the groceries would make Margaret feel cared for. She had never asked how it made Margaret feel. That uncomfortable thought followed her all the way. Back to work. We often measure kindness by our intention. The person receiving it has to live with the consequence. When Emily returned, David was waiting. You went to the hospital. She stared at him. How do you know? Her grandson called the store asking whether we could deliver groceries. Emily waited for another lecture. Instead, David handed her a piece of paper. It contained the phone number for a local senior assistance program. They help with prescription costs and grocery delivery. Emily looked at him. You knew about this? My mother used them. For the first time in 6 years, Emily realized she knew almost nothing about David Collins. His mother had developed Parkinson's disease 7 years earlier. For almost 4 years, David had managed her medications, bills, appointments, and groceries while working full-time. There had been months when she refused assistance because accepting help made her feel dependent. "I used to bring her groceries without asking," David said. She hated it. Emily remembered Margaret. "So, what did you do?" "I stopped deciding what help she needed." That sentence stayed with Emily. The next morning, Margaret's grandson returned. This time, David spoke with him. Not about free groceries, about the senior program, about prescription assistance, about home delivery options, about benefits Margaret might qualify for, but had never applied for. But there was a problem. Margaret refused all of it. "I don't need strangers taking care of me," she told her grandson. Emily wanted to drive straight back to the hospital and argue with her. David stopped her. "You can't force dignity onto someone by taking their choices away." "So we do nothing?" "I didn't say that." David had an idea. Bellwether Market had recently been throwing away increasing amounts of food from its bakery and produce sections. Bread reached its sell-by date. Bananas became too ripe. Packages were cosmetically damaged. Most couldn't be sold, but much of it was still usable. David had been trying for months to get corporate approval for a donation partnership. The paperwork had stalled. Emily looked at him. "You want to give it to Margaret?" "No." "Then what?" "I want to fix the problem without making Margaret the problem." That was the first moment Emily saw what David had been trying to explain. Helping one woman mattered. Creating something that didn't require her to stand at a checkout counter feeling ashamed mattered, too. David contacted the Bellwether Community Center. Emily contacted a local church pantry. Jenna spoke with a volunteer organization that delivered meals to seniors. Within 2 weeks, they had a proposal. Unsold eligible food from Bellwether Market would be collected several times a week and distributed through existing community programs. Nobody would have to explain themselves at a checkout counter. Nobody would have to ask a cashier for mercy. And employees wouldn't have to decide which customers deserved exceptions. Corporate initially rejected it. Liability concerns, transportation, storage, paperwork. David kept pushing. That surprised Emily more than anything. The man she had thought cared more about policy than people was now spending evenings fighting corporate policy. One afternoon, she found him on the phone saying, "If we're paying employees to throw edible food into a dumpster, while customers 2 blocks away are skipping meals, then our system is stupid." Emily waited until he hung up. David looked at her. "What?" She smiled. "Nothing. Say it." "I didn't know managers were allowed to call systems stupid. Only when nobody important is listening." It was the first time Emily had ever heard him make a joke. But their plan still didn't solve Margaret's immediate problem. She returned to the store 3 weeks after her fall. Emily saw her walking slowly toward Register 4. She looked thinner. Margaret placed 6 items on the belt. No cinnamon roll. Emily scanned everything. Margaret handed her cash. Exact change. Neither woman mentioned the hospital. Neither mentioned the groceries Emily had purchased. Then Margaret pulled something from her handbag. $7.12. She placed it beside the register. Emily stared at the money. "What is this?" "What I owe you." "Mrs. Ellis, absolutely not." Margaret pushed it toward her. "I told you, I don't take charity." Emily looked across the store. David was watching. For a moment, she wanted him to intervene. He didn't. This was her decision. Emily looked back at Margaret. 3 weeks earlier, she would have refused the money. Now she understood that accepting it might actually be the kinder choice. So she took it. "Thank you." Margaret's shoulders relaxed. Then Emily did something else. She picked up a cinnamon roll from beside her register. Margaret narrowed her eyes. "Emily, it isn't free. Then what is it?" Emily pointed at the small break room coffee jar beside her station. "You owe me coffee next Thursday." Margaret looked at her for several seconds, then laughed. It was the first time Emily had heard that laugh in more than a month. That's a terrible financial arrangement. I've made worse. Margaret took the cinnamon roll, and that could have been the end of the story. Except the following Monday, Bellwether Market received approval for the food donation program. David posted the announcement in the employee break room. Emily read it twice. The program wasn't named after Margaret. She would have hated that. It wasn't named after Emily either. It simply said, Bellwether Community Food Partnership. The first week, they donated 286 pounds of food. The second week, 341. Within 2 months, 3 other Bellwether Market locations joined. Margaret eventually agreed to use the community center's prescription assistance program. Not because Emily begged her, not because David forced her. Her grandson showed her that the program was partially funded by taxes and community donations she herself had contributed to for decades. You mean I've been paying into this thing? For years. Margaret considered that. Well, she said, then I suppose I should get my money's worth. When Emily heard the story, she laughed for nearly a minute. But something else changed. David removed Emily's written warning. She noticed during her quarterly review, you didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. Why? Because the policy was incomplete. Emily smiled. That's a very managerial apology. It's the only kind you're getting. Then he became serious. You were right to care. Emily waited. And you were right that caring isn't enough? David nodded. Something like that. Months later, Emily would still think about the afternoon she paid $7.12 for an elderly woman's groceries. At first, she believed the story was simple. A woman needed food. A manager enforced a heartless rule. A cashier chose kindness. But real life is rarely that convenient. David wasn't heartless. The rule hadn't appeared from nowhere. Margaret wasn't waiting for someone to rescue her. And Emily's good intentions didn't automatically mean she understood what Margaret needed. All 3 of them had been right about something. All 3 had been wrong about something too. Maybe that's why the moment mattered. Because kindness isn't always paying for someone's groceries. Sometimes kindness is noticing. Sometimes it's asking. Sometimes it's changing a system. And sometimes it's respecting someone enough to let them repay $7.12, because that small act gives them something more important than money. Choice. A few months later, Emily was working Register 4 when Margaret appeared at exactly 10 in the morning. She placed oatmeal, milk, eggs, bananas, and tea on the belt. Then, last of all, a cinnamon roll. Emily looked at it. Living dangerously again? Margaret smiled. At my age, somebody has to. Emily scanned the roll. And this time, Margaret didn't count coins. Not because she had suddenly become wealthy. Not because a millionaire had appeared. Not because every problem in her life had disappeared. She simply had enough. Sometimes that's the happy ending nobody writes stories about. Not a mansion, not a fortune, not revenge. Just enough. Enough food, enough medicine, enough dignity, and enough people around you who understand that helping someone doesn't always mean deciding for them. Now think about that first moment again. Margaret standing at the checkout. David telling her to put the bread back. Emily reaching into her pocket. If you had been standing behind that register, what would you have done? Would you have followed the rule? Would you have paid? And after hearing why the rule existed, would your answer still be the same? Maybe there isn't one perfect answer, but there is one question worth remembering. When someone needs help, are we helping them in the way that makes us feel generous, or in the way that actually helps them? Because sometimes the difference between those two things is only $7.12. And sometimes it's everything.